and thanks for the invitation to come and talk to you this afternoon. I want to spend about 45 minutes exploring the world of chicken breeding as understood in the archaeological record. I want to start off really by providing a sort of a background, kind of a very brief overview of what the study of chicken bones can reveal archaeologically, what kinds of information we can get. So I know some of you don't have an archaeological background, just to give you some sense of the range of questions we can ask. And then I'm going to take a chronological tour, a brief chronological tour through what the archaeological evidence is telling us about selective breeding of chickens. The examples that I'll draw upon, reflecting my own research, are based in the UK, by and large anyway. So fingers crossed this is going to work. Okay, great. So in terms of the zooarchaeology chickens, one of the things, chicken bones are routinely recovered on archaeological sites from really the Roman period onwards. I'll talk a little bit about the Iron Age later on, but really from the Roman period onwards, we start to see chicken bones on archaeological sites around Europe. One of the key things that we need to do as archaeologists is to be able to identify those species, because there are some other native and non-native galliforms that we need to separate out from chickens. So things that are difficult to speciate, for example, are things like pheasant, guinea fowl, and black grouse. So we have to be sure when we're making our identifications that we're actually dealing with chicken bones. So that has really, that problem has really dominated discussion of the domestication of chickens in China, for example, and Southeast Asia, as you'll probably be aware of. There's quite a lot of information we can yield from the skeletal remains of chickens, as we can from other species as well. We can determine their age at death based on the morphology of their skeleton. So we can effectively tell the difference between chicks, juvenile birds, and adult birds. So they're kind of that, because we're just relying on changing morphology and development of the skeleton. But we can more or less separate out these quite reliably. We can determine the sex of the birds, where we've got, there we go. See, I knew she'd scratch me. Off she'd go. We can determine the sex of the bones. We can do that in three ways, really, morphologically. We can do that by the presence or absence of the spur or a spur scar on the tarsometatarsus, as in this example on the right here. We can use measurements because chickens are profoundly sexually dimorphic. Gets a bit more complicated when you start castrating chickens, but we'll talk a little bit about that later maybe. And also we can see evidence for laying hens by the presence of medullary bone. So medullary bone is new bone that's laid down inside the shafts of long bones as a calcium reservoir for the production of eggshell. So it kind of prevents, in principle, it prevents chickens becoming cyclically osteoporotic when they're laying eggs. So there are a number of indicators we can use to determine the sex of chickens archaeologically. As you can see here, we can look at butchering marks. There's a couple of knife marks on the base of this tibiotarsus, for example, and that can tell us about how those birds are being exploited, what products they're being exploited for. Is it for feathers? Is it for meat, for example? And how those carcasses are being divided. We can also look at the different parts of the body that are present on archaeological sites and where they occur in different archaeological features within an archaeological site. So this is an example on the right-hand side of a huge dump of chicken feet. Effectively, you've got the tarsometatarsus at the top, and you've got the hind limb phalanges at the bottom. Massive dump of chicken feet that was recovered from the site of Wigmore Castle in Herefordshire, dated to the mid-13th century, or mid-12th to mid-13th century. I think we worked out there was a minimum number of something like 30 chickens had been processed in one single meal event. We didn't find the rest of the chickens archaeologically. Clearly, we've got here dressing waste from the consumption of chickens, but you can look at this on a micro scale. So you can look at how food preparation and food consumption activities are taking place on a site, for example, or you can also look at this on a larger scale as well. So it may be familiar to many of you now that there's a massive global trade in different parts of chickens, with brown meat heading off to Asian markets and white meat coming over to European and North American markets, for example. So there's this pattern is writ large now within an international context. We can see some signs for disease and injury in the skeletons of chickens as well. Obviously, we're only dealing with the skeleton, we're only dealing with the hard tissues, and not all diseases that a bird will suffer from will be evidenced in the skeleton. In fact, the skeleton is quite conservative in relation to responses to disease, and it's one of the last, very often the last tissue type to exhibit any kind of changes. But there are certain types of diseases that we can see archaeologically that are kind of quite interesting. The example on the bottom here is what is known in archaeological context as avian osteopetrosis. It's not really an osteopetrosis. It's the consequence of the avian leukosis virus, which can cause massive new bone formation within and outside the hollow bones of poultry. And when you do find it, it's an interesting disease. When you do find it, because it's a disease that only affects chickens in a small number of infected cases, where you've got it in high proportions archaeologically, it's telling you that you've got a significant disease load within your population. So there are certain types of diseases we can see, some infectious diseases we can see, and the example on the top is a heel fracture of a tarsometatarssus, chicken tarsometatarssus. So again, we can look at the way these birds are handled, treated, and whether there's any palliative care. The kinds of injuries that they suffer from. Some of those may, the birds wouldn't necessarily survive with those sort of conditions in the wild. So it gives us some sense of how those birds are perceived and treated. Through stabilized, so bone chemistry, we can look at the diet of these birds. So we can take samples of the collagen and determine the ratios of carbon 12 to carbon 13 and nitrogen 14 and nitrogen 15, and they can be used as proxies for diet, and that can be quite an interesting way of exploring whether this. So looking at the isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, for example, give us a good indication of the kinds of food these birds are consuming. So chickens are naturally omnivorous, so they will have a range of diets. And when we look at the stable isotope distribution for archaeological chickens, we can see that reflected. There are some birds are taking in more nitrogen 15 than others proportionally, and that tends to be an indication of a more sort of meatier sort of diet, if you like. Others are more grain-based. You can, with stable isotopes, and what this graph on the right illustrates is that there's a profound difference in the stable isotope value for C3 temperate plants. Temperate plants that have a C3 photosynthetic pathway, and those that have a C4 photosynthetic pathway, so tropical plants. And you can see here that all our archaeological chickens from Britain are plotting with quite high, relatively high carbon 13 ratios, whereas those modern ones are all the way down the bottom. The reason they have such low values is they're all fed on a single product, and that's maize, which is a C4 tropical plant. And so we can see, we can see the introduction of C4 plants into Europe and their widespread adoption as animal feeds based on archaeological evidence. We can also then, and this is going to be the focus of what I'll be talking about, look at the shape, size, and appearance of poultry. We do that really in three ways. There are certain features within the skeleton that are characteristic of certain types, morphotypes of chicken. So I'll give some examples of those later on, but you can see here, this chicken on the left will make an appearance quite shortly, and I'll explain its context. But you can see here, you've got a normal domestic chicken and a chicken that has a disproportionate dwarfism. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But you can see same bone, but short, stumpy, thickened. So there are certain morphological characters that can tell us about certain morphotypes of chicken. And do not, I use the word morphotypes rather than breeds, because we're talking about a time period where there is no record. For most of the period I'm talking about, we're not dealing with recorded breed lines. So there's no sort of documentation, written documentation about breed lines. So morphotype is a better description of what we're talking about here. Land races, varieties, rather than breeds per se. We can measure bones. Something I spend a lot of time doing, looking at taking a series of measurements in different anatomical planes. So we can take lengths, widths, and depths. That can tell us about the changing size of the birds. It can also tell us about the changing shape as well. So quite a traditional approach to metrics. This is being advanced more recently by the application of geometric morphometrics. And the image on the right-hand side shows you a chicken coracoid that's been landmarked for geometric morphometric analysis. The problem with the standard metrics that we take with calipers, it's great, it's easy, it's simple to take those measurements. And they do give us information about shape in those three anatomical planes, but you can get the same shape ratios from very different shaped bones depending on their appearance. So it's quite a clunky way of looking at shape. And what geometric morphometrics does is it provides a way of looking at the relationships between known anatomical points on bones and looking at the mathematical relationship between those points. So it's a multivariate statistical analysis of shape. What the power of geometric morphometrics has is that it scales for size. So when you're doing your analysis, you're just comparing shape between different bones. You're not. The difficulty with using standard metrics is you've got a conflation of shape and size together, which makes interpretation quite difficult sometimes. So there are three sort of tools that we have as zoo archaeologists to try and understand changing breeding practices. Of course, and Ophelia will have talked about this already, increasingly, we've got the potential to use ancient DNA to tell us about specific aspects of the appearance of those birds, where specific parts, specific genes or particular loci are related to very specific kinds of physical attributes. So I'm thinking here, things like feather color, comb and wattle shape are good examples. Ophelia, I think, talked about the color of legs in chickens previously. I'm not going to repeat that, but just to say, increasingly, I think that will be the direction in which indicators as well. So hopefully that gives you some sense of what we can do as zoo archaeologists in terms of the analysis of chicken bones. We can say pick up some of this later on. I want to focus now on what we do know so far. This work has arisen from a major multidisciplinary project, the cultural perceptions of human-chicken interactions, that finished a few years ago now, funded by the AHRC. So what I'm presenting here is, and you'll see that in the acknowledgements later on, is some of the work that I've done, but also some of the work that I've done in collaboration with other members of that team. And it really has sort of helped to transform our understanding of the role and significance of chickens in society. So I want to start at the beginning, really. So in terms of the introduction of a domestic species, chicken arrives quite late in our fauna. So obviously, cattle, sheep, pigs are arriving in the Neolithic. Horses are coming in late Neolithic into the Bronze Age. Chickens don't come into the Iron Age. So we're in the UK, we're quite a marginal outpost for the domestication, for the arrival of the chicken, if you like. And I always kind of contemplate what it was like for the first person to see a chicken. I mean, because there isn't anything quite like it in the British bird fauna. So, you know, just in terms of the way it looks, the way it behaves, the way it moves, it blows my mind to think about what it would have been like. It'd be like, I don't know, going down the street and seeing a flamingo or something, I imagine. So the first chickens that we have reliably date to the Middle Iron Age. So we're talking about around 400 BC-ish, give or take. So 4th, 3rd century BC. And these are a couple of partial skeletons of some of our earliest chickens that we have in Britain, from Houghton Down and Western Down. What's interesting about the fact that when we get the first chickens arriving in Britain, and I think it bespeaks of this kind of the exoticness of this species and its introduction, is that we find them as partial skeletons. We find them buried as complete or near complete skeletons. And we tend to find them in unusual burial locations. They're not occurring in the kinds of burial locations that you expect for normal food refuse. We've also got some indication of how they might be treated. So one of the earliest specimens we've got from has got a healed fracture of a tarsometatarsus, suggesting that potentially these are birds that are protected. They're not being predated, and the bone had time to heal. And chicken lived some time after that. So, you know, these are interesting deposits. When we look at so I'm going to repeat this graph. It'll show up on a number of slides as we go through. So this is a graph showing you some bone measurements of chickens from the Iron Age through to the modern period. So modern here is 18th and 19th century, not modern as in now. It's an archaeological modern. It's a huge corpus of all the chicken bones that have been measured in the UK. And we can see, and what I've done is, with these diagrams, I've log scaled them so that we can compare the different measurements together on the same axis. Anybody's interested in the technique, I can talk about it later on. But it just simplifies the visuals. So if you have a look at the Iron Age, for example, we don't have a massive corpus. So but chickens are very rare. They only occur in south central Britain. We only have a small number of examples. They get more common as we get towards the incorporation of Britain into the Roman Empire, which I'll come on to. But small number of samples, admittedly, but these birds are small. They're tiny. They're the smallest chickens we get archaeologically in Britain. And in fact, morphologically, when you compare the size, they're not dissimilar in size and shape to the ancestral jungle fowl. So this is the red jungle fowl here. So we can imagine quite a small bird. You know, the males are brightly coloured, potentially quite dramatic. Introduction. What's interesting is that so Caesar's trying to invade Britain in 54 BC and he fails, but he does write about his campaign, and in that campaign, in the text describing that campaign, De Bello Gallico, he describes that the Britons are rather odd. The Britons are rather odd because they don't eat chickens. They keep them for their own amusement and pleasure. So these birds are not birds for food. These are not birds for consumption in the Iron Age. And that's echoed in the archaeological records. So when we first find chickens in the Iron Age, for example, they're, as I've said, they're in special deposits. They're in pits, for example, very often buried in pots, complete. This is an Iron Age pit from an Iron Age pot from the site of Market Deeping from about 100 BC with a chicken in it. we've got this really, I don't know whether any of you saw this recently. It was in the news probably earlier this year. This is a really fine helmet. This was reconstruction was part of an exhibit at the Novia Museum in Chichester, and it highlights the finds recovered from the grave of an Iron Age warrior, possibly from France, who was buried with a really elaborate helmet with ornate bronze latticework crest. And the reconstruction, the helmet has been likened to a cockerel's comb, and they suggest it may have even been surmounted by feathers rather than the brush, which I really rather like. So chickens are special. They appear on coinage in the Iron Age as well. They're really they are special creatures, magical birds. The Romans really popularized the chicken, it's fair to say. When by the time we get to the Roman period, we get many more chickens appearing in the archaeological record. I'll show you that later on. We also see quite a striking increase in the size of those birds. So Roman incorporation of Britain, so the incorporation of Britain into the Roman Empire, AD 43. So from the mid first century onwards, we see a real increase in the number of these chickens and the size of them. So we start to see, this is a bar chart showing you the frequency of chicken bones on archaeological sites, and shows you, relatively low numbers in the Iron Age over on the left, and this increase by the time we get into the Roman period in the 1st to 3rd centuries. We get a stronger sense by the time we get to the Roman period that they quite liked eating them. They quite like eating chickens, and they quite like eating eggs. So this is an extract from the Vinderlander Tablet. So some tablets from written on bark from the Roman fort at Vinderlander on Hadrian's Wall. And you get records of, send me chickens, 20 chickens I want, and 100 or 200 eggs if they are for sale at a good price. So we get a sense that, chickens and eggs are becoming much more important as part of foodways. We see that archaeologically too. This is the late 1st century amphitheatre at Chester. And underneath the seating and the banks of seating at the amphitheatre, we find huge numbers of eggs belonging to chickens. We can use scanning electron microscopy. That's kind of cool. One of my colleagues, Julia Best, who works at Cardiff, she looks at these eggshells under scanning electron microscope. She can identify them as belonging to chicken, not other bird species, and also tell whether they were hatchlings or if they were fresh eggs. Because if they're hatchlings, the inside of the shell resorbs as the calcium from the shell is being drawn upon by the developing fetus. So she can say whether they're eggs that are just making more chickens for your production, or if you're actually just eating these. And the evidence from the amphitheatre suggests there's a roaring trade in boiled eggs as a kind of snack food in the amphitheatre, which is kind of fun. But food is not the only part of the story for chickens in the Roman period. And I think, we have this mindset of chickens being about food, about economy. We think about them in terms of protein, but you look everywhere cross-culturally around the world, you can see the relationship that people have with chickens is much more complicated and diverse. We know the Romans, for example, are avid cockfighters. And this might be one of the explanations for the increased size of the chickens that we see in the archaeological record in this period. One thing we can do, as I said earlier, is we can sex those chickens. So we can have a look at the ratio between males and females, between cockerels and hens. And if we look at the Iron Age, for example, we can see, we look at the Roman period here. So from the 1st century AD through to the 4th century AD, you can see that the proportion of cockerels, so these orange bars, is much higher than it is in any other time period subsequently. So you've got quite a high proportion of cockerels entering the archaeological record relative to the number of hens, which is not really a sustainable economic system. You don't need lots of cockerels. And this is if I just looked at urban sites, this would be even more profound. So we've got a particularly high proportion of cockerels on urban sites, and it's highly likely a lot of these are being bred for cockfighting. Of course, the males are much larger than the hens, and that might be partially driving up that size increase in chickens that we see in the archaeological record. So cockfighting is important, but chickens and cockerels are also important in religion, which may also be another reason why they appear in high frequencies. And because these are the kinds of sites that archaeologists excavate. You know, we excavate towns, we excavate religious sites. This is a graph showing you just a biplot between the greatest length and approximal breadth measurement of the femur from a massive dump of chicken bones. These are, in this case, from a Roman 4th century AD Roman site of Ely in Gloucestershire, which is a temple to Mercury, who's figured over on the left here. And Mercury is linked with three animals, in fact, actually, the goat, the tortoise, and the cockerel. And clearly at this site, what you're seeing here on this graph is you can see an abundance of measurements over on the left-hand side. So these are bigger, taller, wider chicken bones. So these are cockerels. The small little cluster over on the bottom left, they're the hens. So a very small number of hens and a large number of cockerels. So big, we can see at this site, we can see this deliberate selection and slaughtering of cockerels to satisfy this particular deity. So cockerels are important. So cockerels are important for religion. We know that cockerels are used also in augury as well, for telling the future. And we see evidence of the significance of cockerels in burials as well. So we have this really beautiful bronze cockerel statue come out of excavations in Cirencester a few years ago, dated to about AD 150. I think it was a burial of a child, if I remember correctly. So, cockerels are significant. These birds are important beyond just eating them, beyond just food. One of the striking things about the bones from Ely is that we start to see, and it really is a phenomenon that begins with the Roman period, we start to see the selective breeding of birds with particular characteristics. So this is the example I showed you at the very beginning. This is a very short, stumpy tarso-metatarsus compared with a regular sized specimen. And it shows you we've got a very short, thickened bone. This is characteristic of a disproportionate dwarfism. So this is kind of like the dachshund of the chicken world. And this particular form of dwarfism, this particular form of, is normally carried by by the creeper gene. So it's a gene in which results in this kind of shortening of the limbs. And you can see what it looks like in this Japanese bantam that's in the middle here. So they're basically walking on the flats. Instead of walking on their toes, they're walking on the tarso-metatarsi, if you like, on their feet. It does result in problems for these birds. So 1 in 4 of these birds won't be able to survive hatching, for example. Only the heterozygote will survive. But what we found at Ely, at this Roman temple, we found 3 of these. At other Roman sites in Britain, we find other clusters of these. Now, this kind of condition can result as a spontaneous mutation. It can just occur as a random mutation within the population. That's perfectly normal as a form of disproportionate dwarfism. What we see, though, the fact that we've got these clusters occurring in the Roman period suggests they're actually being selectively bred. So they are being deliberately chosen on aesthetic grounds. In fact, we've got this great reference from Columella here, who I think is probably talking about dwarf chickens when he describes, I do not highly commend bantams for fecundity or any other return unless one takes pleasure in their low stature, which I quite like that. We get other variants as well. So at Ely again, we see another variant morphotype appearing in the archaeological record for the first time. And that's birds with feathered crests. So this is typical of certain modern breeds of chickens, like the Poland, the Silky, and particularly with the Poland, basically what you get, you've got the skulls, the skull of one of these examples illustrated from Uli here. You can see that it's got this herniated skull. So you've got the normal dome of the skull, but instead you've got this kind of it becomes bulbous, and you get these perforations appearing in the outer table of the skull. And the reason for that is because the brain has herniated, so it's pushing the cranium upwards and outwards and thinning, and the cranium becomes thinned. But what happens in these birds is that herniated brain is surmounted by a fatty pad, and on that fatty pad you get these kind of crazy feathers that hang over the bird's face, so it can't see where it's going. And again, so it's aesthetically an interesting bird, and they are still kept now. Many people keep these as a fancy fowl. They're problematic because you can't keep them with other kinds of birds, because if they get pecked, they can kill the birds, because basically the brain is exposed. But again, we see this for the first time with the Roman period. We see this selection for these birds with aesthetic qualities. The other type of bird that we see in the Roman period for the first time is chickens with 5 toes. And again, this is characteristic of certain types of modern breeds, like the Dorking, for example, figured here on the left. And there's an archaeological illustration of one of these examples in the middle here. Effectively, you have an additional condyle for the additional toe, which you can, if you look at the base of the foot and go head upwards, you can see the condyle just poking out behind this big shield of bone. And again, we have our written testimony, this time from Pliny the Elder, to describe that some birds, some chickens have toes of unequal number. And in fact, I think Columella also describes them as being particularly delicious. So we have these kind of, again, differing in the archaeological record, and it's backed up with what we have in the written sources. It's probably no wonder that we've got this variation in the Roman period. The Romans are really messing around with all species, in fact. So this is just a slide that was prepared by one of my PhD students who's just graduated, Lauren. She's been looking at selective breeding of dogs in the Roman world. And this is just a selection of the variety of the humerus in dog species. We see, again, chondrodysplastic dogs, so dogs with shortened and twisted limb bones. We see dogs with brachycephalic dogs with the kind of domed heads and the big bulgy eyes, for example. So Romans are messing around with cattle, sheep, pigs. They are interested in selective breeding, and we see an interesting diversity of variants appearing in all our domestic species. By the time we get to the Saxon period, things change. So the Roman army disappears, goes away. We emerge into the early medieval period. The size of chickens drops considerably in this period. I think the likely explanation is we still do see some of those little creeper chickens appearing, maybe not quite as often, but this decline in size is probably as much to do with changing balances of sex of the birds being kept. So as I said before, in the Roman period, we have this dominance of cockerels. By the time we get to the early medieval period, however, we get this real sharp increase in the relative abundance of hens relative to cockerels. And we've argued that this is a consequence of changing dietary norms. We see a real increase in the amount of egg consumption, and particularly as part of a monastic tradition around the non-consumption of meat from 4-legged animals on saints' days and holidays. So if you're not, part of the kind of monastic laws is it kind of governs about what you should eat and when you should eat it. But eggs are a really good protein source if you can't eat the meat of 4-legged animals. So we start to see this kind of real emergence of a kind of an emphasis, if you like, in chicken keeping on egg production. And we see that in the decrease in the size of the bones. We see it in the sex profiles. And I'm just going to go back forward one here. And we also see it genetically. So Ophelia would have talked about this genetic change that we see in the archaeological record around or just after 1000 AD, where we see a massive increase in the frequency of this gene called the TSHR gene, which is this TSHR locus, which is part of the genome associated with reduced aggression and faster onset of egg laying. So there's a selection pressure towards egg laying that we see around 1100 years ago. That again probably testifies to what's happening with the slightly earlier emphasis on egg production. So we're starting to see this selection pressure revealed. That said, having said that, there's this production on this emphasis on egg production doesn't mean that there isn't any variation in the poultry populations of Britain at this time. There certainly is. So this is some work conducted by Alison Foster, again another one of my PhD students, who's looking at geometric morphometrics to try and see if we can make any comparison between modern poultry breeds of established history, so kind of the older breeds of modern poultry, and what we see in the archaeological record. So these graphs show you these principal components analyses show you the kind of comparison on the left-hand side between three Anglo-Saxon sites. So on the top you've got Coppergate, on the middle you've got Flixborough, and the bottom you've got Lyminge, with those modern data sets looking at the shape of those modern poultry. What that shows you fundamentally is that pretty much all of the Anglo-Saxon poultry are much more slender than all the modern breeds. So they're all up at the sort of top right, and all the Anglo-Saxon ones are primarily down towards the bottom. Sorry, the modern ones are up at the top left. Anglo-Saxon ones are all down towards the bottom right. But if you look at the graph on the right, what you see on that is you see three Anglo-Saxon sites compared in terms of their shapes of this is the coracoid being compared here, and you can see the red dots are the birds from Coppergate, and you can see they sit at slightly more north position. They have a slightly different shape than the birds from the other two sites, so from Flixborough and Lyminge. So we know there are morphotypes. They're probably like equivalent to land races, that in particular areas you get particular types of birds being bred. So we can get some sense of that. What that actually means in terms of their kind of physical attributes is more difficult to determine, because we're just looking at shapes of individual bones here. By the time we get into the medieval period, we can see from this graph that chickens become much more common on archaeological sites. So we see a real rise and increase in their abundance on archaeological sites, and we see it also reflected in sort of medieval and later manuscripts as well. So Platina is a 15th century Italian Renaissance writer, praises the delicacy of the flesh of the chicken. There's quite a lot of links between the kind of the white meat, the dryness of the chicken, and good. It's neutral humorally, so it's good for your humoral balances. It's a good food to eat. Unlike beef, for example, which will just give you indigestion or whatever. It's considered to be a good food in health terms. What's interesting about what happens with chickens is it's fairly astonishing what happens to the size of chickens by the time we get into the medieval period. And I'm really here talking about the late medieval period. So I'm really talking about the 14th century. The size of chickens in the 14th and 15th century is transformed in Britain. They undergo a huge increase in size. Again, so 14th, 15th century, we see a real sharp increase in the size of these birds. And again, in the 16th and 17th century, they get really big, really quickly. It's a really interesting phenomenon, but it's not isolated. This is part of a wider change in selective and, I think, directed breeding in this period. We see it in cattle, we see it in sheep, we see it in pigs, and we see it in chickens. So these are data. So this is a different data set here I'm showing you, but this is data set from archaeological sites in London, but it shows you exactly the same phenomenon for all 4 species. We get this kind of quite significant increase in size in all these livestock in the late 14th century. I've provided you with a copy of a paper that two papers in advance of this, and one of those explores the reasons for this. And you know, I've strongly argued before that I see this being linked to the transformation of society and the agricultural economy that happens in the wake of the Black Death, because the entire economic base of England changes in a very significant way, and farming becomes new. We get emergent classes of farmers who are becoming landowners, who are driving agricultural productivity. So there's a in the earlier medieval period, the kind of most of the farming is done by peasants on behalf of the lord. There is no pressure for kind of investing in agriculture, effectively. So it size is fairly static in the earlier part of the medieval period, but then we get this transformation after this Black Death, which is the time period when we see an increase in the number of sort of middle-class landowners who are more driven to increase the productivity of their farms. So you can, I've argued about this before. The other thing that happens in this period, it's also the time period when you've got this emergent landed class who, unlike the aristocracy, don't have large fancy residences. They don't have huge amounts of money. They don't have titles. What they do have is land and they're practicing farming. And what we can see is that there is a status to be had from having large animals. And if you think about the some of the landscape paintings and the agricultural painting, you see the kind of like the absolute unit of merles, the massive sheep and the kind of really square cows. And for example, it's kind of in this period we start to see that. And there's a real I think there's also a status seeking amongst these farmers that rather than expressing their kind of their knowledge and their status through, you know, the size of their residence, for example, they're doing it through their farming. And we certainly see that. So, you know, if we don't really get the agricultural writers appearing frequently in print until we get the printing press. So it's in the 16th and 17th century we get some of the text that talk really about directed breeding. But you know, Gervase Markham, 1648, describing that cockerels should present a large and well-sized body, long from head to the rump and thick in the garth, while the biggest and largest hens are the best. The real emphasis on actually breeding for size, and that becomes important in all livestock in that period. That's not to say we don't also get these varieties. So we continue to see, when we get into the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, we get to see the emergence, the kind of re-emergence, if you like, of these different types of poultry. So we see creeper chickens coming back in, these dwarf species. What's interesting is that in the Roman period, we've seen these on you know, temple religious sites, for example. So they're clearly being picked out for that reason. In the 17th century, they're being described as being the most delicious kind of chicken to eat. So Ulysses Aldrovandi, who's writing in the late 16th century, you know, describes them as food for a feast. And this specimen on the left here has come from a Tudor feasting pit from Chester. So indicating that these birds are still associated, these variants are still associated with status in this period. We also get the continuation of those other characteristics we saw in the Roman period. They sort of disappear. These variants sort of disappear as we go into the sort of Saxon and early medieval period. We don't seem to get so many examples, but again, we can see this resurgence of morphotypes as we get into the late medieval and into the early modern period. So this is an 18th century example of a feathered chicken with the herniated cranium. By the time we get to the 19th century, so something transformative happens. So in the 19th century, we get an absolute explosion of chicken breeds. Unfortunately, what we don't have is we don't have many archaeological sites with chicken bones dating to this period. So there's not because of municipal clearance at this point, we don't get great deposits of animal bones where they were processed, where people were eating chickens and processing chickens. So it's more difficult to sort of track what's happening archaeologically in this period. But certainly we know from written sources that by the time we get to the 19th century, there is a real interest in chicken breeding. And this is partly because we get the banning of cockfighting in the 19th century and the redirection of the efforts towards breeding birds for fighting towards breeding birds for display, part of the sort of Victorian gentrification, if you like, of working class practices. And we see that, and you look at all the breed clubs, the chicken breed clubs, dog breed clubs, cat breed clubs, they all emerge in that late 19th century context. You know, we've got around the world today, they estimate there's about 1,400 different breeds of chickens, which is really a rather astonishing variety. Sadly, the majority of chickens in the world today are all genetically identical. So I think there are 3 companies worldwide that provide all the poults for chicken breeding, and increasingly the genome of these birds is being increasingly fixed by gene editing. You know, because it produces, you know, these birds produce a lot of protein. They grow really quickly. I mean, it's astonishing to think that, you know, a chicken now is sort of roast chicken sized after what, 34, 35 days. Compare that, I'm just put the comparison on here on the right hand side that shows you a red jungle fowl. So this is the wild ancestor of all our domestic chickens. It's of exactly the same age. So it's a 34, 35 day old jungle fowl. And just showing you the scale of what we've done in terms of selective breeding of these birds. And again, just to put what the kind of the broiler chicken in context, we can see that. So this is a comparison of the London data set here. We've got red jungle fowl over on the left-hand side in yellow. We've got these archaeological data sets in green, showing you that increase in the medieval period. And then up at the top there, you've got, well, it's 19 year ago data set for broilers now, but you can just see how considerably different. There's no variation in their size, and they're much significantly larger than anything that's gone before, which is sort of the stepping stone really for the second paper that I circulated, which is about arguing that the broiler chicken and the development of the broiler chicken, because it's distinctive compared with any other chicken that's ever lived on the planet previously, is distinctive in terms of its size, its shape, its genetics, its bone chemistry, that it might be a useful marker for the Anthropocene in a future fossil record. But I'll leave you to read the paper. It's another story for another day, that one. Okay, I'll stop there because I think I'm about out of time. Just want to say that this is work that's, you know, massive collaborative effort between lots of colleagues. I shamelessly borrowed images and graphs from many of my colleagues in producing this presentation. So I just want to thank everybody here for all their input. So